Okay, I want to start with a quote, not from CNN, not from Fox News, not from any American source. This quote is from Sun Degang, the director of Fudan University's Center for Middle Eastern Studies in Shanghai. He published this in China's state-run Global Times just days after the ceasefire memorandum was signed on June 17, 2026. He wrote this. He said, "Is the scene that cast a shadow over the British Empire during the Suez crisis now being replayed for the United States in the Strait of Hormuz?" That is a Chinese academic writing in a Chinese state publication, comparing the United States in 2026 to the British Empire in 1956. And if you know your history, you know exactly what that comparison means. Because in 1956, Britain tried to reassert imperial control over the Suez Canal through military force. And it failed. Not because it lost militarily. Britain won on the battlefield. Britain failed because the political, economic, and diplomatic cost of winning was so high that the victory itself became the humiliation. Britain withdrew, and it never recovered its status as a global power after that. It was the moment the world understood that the British Empire was over. Sun Degang is saying that moment is now repeating for America in the Strait of Hormuz in 2026. Now, I want to be honest with you. I am going to put three competing interpretations of this war on the table today, because I think the honest answer to the question of what just happened is more complicated than either the American triumphalists or the American defeatists want to admit. And somewhere inside that complexity is the story that nobody in mainstream media is telling you properly. The story of who actually walked away from this war with something permanent, something that cannot be bombed away, something that cannot be sanctioned away, something that will still be operating and compounding in value 20 years from now. And the answer to that question is not Iran, and it is not America, and it is not Israel. It is a country that never fired a single shot, a country that officially declared itself neutral from day one, a country that spent the entire duration of this war hosting foreign leaders, running back-channel diplomacy, and quietly collecting something more valuable than territory, more durable than a ceasefire agreement, and more strategically significant than any weapons cache in the Middle East. That country is China. And today I am going to show you exactly what it collected, how it did it, and why Washington, for all its aircraft carriers and bunker-busting bombers, is now sitting in a corner it did not see coming. Let's go. All right? To understand how China claimed the prize, you need to understand the three phases of what just happened, because this was not one war. It was three simultaneous operations running in parallel, and only one of them was military. The first operation was the military one. That is the one everyone was watching. Operation Epic Fury, the American and Israeli air campaign that began on February 28, 2026, striking Iranian nuclear facilities, ballistic missile infrastructure, and senior leadership compounds in Tehran. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening hours. Iran retaliated with hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones across the region. The Gulf states absorbed more than 1,700 Iranian ballistic missiles and close to 4,000 drones. Oil shot from $60 a barrel in January to over $100. The Strait of Hormuz was effectively closed to most commercial traffic. 2,000 ships and 20,000 mariners were stranded in the Persian Gulf. Germany and Italy were pushed toward technical recession. Europe's gas benchmarks doubled. Japan warned it could run out of oil within 8 to 9 months if the strait remained closed. The global economy bled. That is the story you were watching on television. That is the story CNN and BBC were running every hour. And it is real. All of it happened. But while everyone was watching that operation, two other operations were running simultaneously. And those are the operations that determined who actually won. The second operation was Iran's legal and diplomatic operation. And I have talked about pieces of this in previous lectures. Iran's strategy from the very beginning was not to defeat America militarily. Iran's strategy was to force America into a legal and diplomatic position that it could not escape from without conceding something permanent. The instrument of that strategy was the Strait of Hormuz, not as a military weapon, but as a legal and economic negotiating asset. Think about what Iran demanded consistently and publicly throughout the entire conflict. International recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, the right to manage traffic and collect fees, no military resolution, only a negotiated one, And when the ceasefire agreement, the Losabad Memorandum of Understanding, was signed on June 17th by Donald Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, Article 5 of that agreement handed Iran administrative authority over the waterway. I have covered Article 5 in detail in a previous lecture. The short version is this. America signed a document that, depending on your reading of the text, gives Iran the right to manage passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, called it precisely that. Iran's parliament is now drafting legislation to codify that authority as domestic law permanently. The Atlantic Council, which is not a pro-Iran publication, put it this way. The deal leaves room for Iran to charge transit fees to commercial vessels after 60 days, and they noted that this suggests the energy trade could soon face a pricing system. Iran's MP Alireza Salimi said it even more directly. He said Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz is not negotiable, and Tehran alone would define and enforce the strait's new rules. Now, the United States went into this war with the stated objectives of eliminating Iran's nuclear program, degrading its missile capabilities, destroying its proxy network, and securing permanent and unconditional free passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Look at where they came out. Iran's uranium is buried under collapsed tunnels and explosive mines at Isfahan. Iran's nuclear program was not dismantled, it was fortified in place. Iran's missile capabilities were degraded but not destroyed. The IRGC's decentralized mosaic defense structure survived. Hezbollah is still in southern Lebanon. Israel is bombing Lebanon right now as I record this. And the Strait of Hormuz is under a ceasefire arrangement that, on Iran's reading of the text, places Tehran in the administrative seat. Is that a clear American victory? I will let you decide, but before you do, I want to show you the third operation, because the third operation is the one that nobody on either side is talking about clearly, and it is the one that will matter most in 20 years. The third operation was China's operation, and unlike the American military operation, which cost tens of billions of dollars and drew down American weapons stockpiles, and unlike Iran's operation, which cost Iran, its supreme leader, its air defense network, thousands of civilian lives, and massive infrastructure damage, China's operation cost Beijing almost nothing. In fact, it profited from it in multiple dimensions simultaneously. And that is what I want to walk you through now in detail. Let me start with what China gained diplomatically, because the diplomatic gains alone would have been worth it. From the moment the war started, China positioned itself as the responsible global power calling for restraint. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi made repeated public calls for an immediate ceasefire. China and Pakistan jointly issued a 5-point peace proposal on March 31st that called for an end to hostilities and resumption of normal navigation in the Strait of Hormuz. The African Union praised the proposal. China and Russia vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that Washington wanted, protecting Iran from further international pressure. And in the final days before the June 17th memorandum was signed, Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister Kazem Garibabadi held direct talks with senior Chinese diplomats. When the deal was done, Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi publicly thanked China for what he described as its constructive role in helping promote negotiations. Now, here's the key thing about all of this. CNN itself acknowledged it. CNN noted that Beijing's very public diplomatic moves amplified its message that while others are waging war, it is a responsible global power and power broker. Henry Wang, the president of the Beijing-based Center for China and Globalization, said directly to Newsweek, the U.S. attacks on Iran with Israel really set an unprecedentedly bad example and dismantled 80 years of the world order. That is a Chinese analyst saying on the record that America just dismantled the world order it spent 80 years building. And China was standing on the other side of that dismantling, positioning itself as the alternative. That is not an accidental message. That is a carefully orchestrated diplomatic harvest. But the diplomatic gains are actually the least valuable of what China collected, because diplomacy is soft. Diplomacy can be reversed. What China also collected during this war is something much harder, something technical, operational, and in some cases classified. Something that gives Beijing a permanent military and strategic edge that it did not have on February 27, 2026. Let me explain what I mean, and I want to be precise here because precision matters. China, prior to this war, had been providing Iran with significant military technology. This is documented. The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission confirmed it. Chinese state-owned companies provided chip-making tools to Iran's military. Chinese firms with links to the People's Liberation Army, specifically Mizar Vision and Jiang Technology, marketed geospatial intelligence about the positions and movements of U.S. forces in the region. Multiple sanctioned Iranian ships carried sodium perchlorate, a precursor material for solid propellant rockets, from China to Iran. And in April 2026, U.S. intelligence assessed that China was preparing to ship man-portable air defense systems to Iran through third countries. China's foreign ministry denied it. But here is the piece that almost nobody is putting in its proper strategic context. And it is the piece that Al Jazeera and Small Wars Journal and Special Eurasia all flagged separately, each from a different angle. Iran's missiles got significantly more accurate during this war compared to the 12-day war of June 2025. Significantly. Former French Foreign Intelligence Director Alain Juillet told Toxin Podcast directly, "One of the surprises in this war is that Iranian missiles are more accurate compared to the war that took place 8 months ago, raising many questions about the guidance systems of these missiles." The answer to that question is BeiDou. China's BeiDou navigation satellite system is the Chinese equivalent of GPS. It became fully operational globally in 2020. It has more than 50 satellites providing worldwide coverage. In military applications, encrypted BeiDou signals can deliver positional accuracy within meter-level or even centimeter-level precision under optimal conditions. And critically, while the United States can jam or degrade its own GPS signal, it has no mechanism to interfere with BeiDou. Because BeiDou is Chinese infrastructure, it is sovereign Chinese technology. The United States cannot reach into China's satellite constellation and turn it off the way it could theoretically degrade GPS access for an adversary. Iran signed a memorandum of understanding with China to integrate BeiDou into its military infrastructure back in 2015. That cooperation was institutionalized under the 25-year Iran-China Comprehensive Strategic Partnership in 2021. When the 12-day war happened in June 2025, Iran was still heavily reliant on U.S.-controlled GPS for drone and missile targeting. And GPS jamming by the United States and Israel dramatically reduced the accuracy of Iranian strikes during that conflict. Iranian missiles reached Israel, but with significantly degraded precision. That is why Iran deactivated GPS reception nationwide toward the end of the 12-day war. And between June 2025 and February 2026, Iran completed its military transition from GPS to BeiDou 3. The result was visible to anyone watching this war carefully. Iranian missile accuracy improved substantially, and the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission formally stated that BeiDou had been used by Iran to direct attacks across the region. Now think about what that means for China, not for Iran, for China, because this is the part that almost no one is saying explicitly. Every missile Iran fired using BeiDou 3 in this conflict was a live-fire test of Chinese satellite navigation technology in a real wartime electromagnetic environment against the most sophisticated jamming and electronic warfare capabilities the United States and Israel possess. Every Iranian drone attack using Chinese radar systems was a real-world performance test of Chinese electronic warfare architecture under combat conditions. China did not have to send a single soldier to get this data. China did not have to risk a single aircraft. Iran did all of that work, and China collected the results. The Small Wars Journal analysis of Chinese intelligence benefits from this conflict made this explicit. They wrote that Beijing will use Iranian combat data to refine its missile and radar systems. And they drew the direct comparison to Russia and Ukraine. If Russia acquired crucial military intelligence on Western armaments from the Ukraine conflict, despite incurring considerable human and military resource costs for Moscow, then the Middle East war could furnish China with practical intelligence on its military equipment, thus preventing Beijing from direct confrontation with the United States. Let that land for a moment. China used Iran the way Russia used its own forces in Ukraine, but at zero cost to Chinese blood, Chinese treasure, and Chinese political capital. Iran was, in the most precise sense of the word, a live-fire laboratory for Chinese military technology, and Beijing harvested the results from a comfortable diplomatic distance, all while calling for peace and positioning itself as the responsible actor. Now here's where I want to introduce a framework. I call it the asymmetric spectator advantage, and I think it is one of the most important concepts for understanding how great power competition actually works in the 21st century. The asymmetric spectator advantage works like this. When two opponents are locked in a direct military confrontation, both sides absorb costs. They burn through weapons stockpiles. They exhaust their military personnel. They spend political capital domestically and diplomatically. They take reputational damage when things go wrong, and things always go wrong in war. Both sides pay the cost of the conflict. But a third actor, one that is strategically positioned as a spectator, can simultaneously avoid those costs while collecting the benefits. Intelligence data, diplomatic positioning, economic opportunity, and the narrative advantage of being the party that did not start the fire. That is exactly what China executed in this conflict. And it executed it with a precision that I think reflects decades of strategic thinking about exactly this scenario. Let me give you the specific economic piece now, because this is also a part of the prize that China quietly claimed. China imports roughly 40% of its crude oil from the Middle East. When the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed in late February 2026, most analysts predicted economic catastrophe for Beijing. Japan and South Korea were forced to immediately draw on emergency strategic reserves. Vietnam faced severe supply disruption. Europe was in crisis. And yet China, as Newsweek reported directly, largely weathered the shock. Why? Because Beijing had prepared. In the first 2 months of 2026, before the war started, Chinese oil imports surged 16% for stockpiling purposes. China had built strategic petroleum reserves estimated at roughly 1.2 billion barrels. It reduced refinery throughput. It had spent years diversifying supply routes, and crucially, it had maintained the special relationship with Iran that ensured Chinese tankers had a different status at the Strait of Hormuz than American-linked vessels. You will recall that from the earliest days of the conflict, there were reports of Iran allowing Chinese-linked tankers preferential passage through the strait. And when Iran began discussing the possibility of allowing oil transit conditional on payments in yuan rather than dollars, Chinese refineries were the natural beneficiaries of that arrangement. China buys over 80% of Iran's oil exports. Most of it was already settling in yuan through CIPS, China's cross-border interbank payment system, rather than through dollar-denominated SWIFT transactions. And now, with the war over and reconstruction beginning, the Atlantic Council stated this directly. The deal leaves room for Iran to charge transit fees to commercial vessels after 60 days, and China would certainly expect to receive favorable rates compared with the United States. The prize China claimed is not just favorable rates on oil. It is preferential access to the world's most strategically important waterway, structured into the ceasefire agreement that America itself signed and administered by a country that China just spent 4 months publicly supporting, diplomatically backing, and technologically enabling. Now, I want to give you the strongest possible version of the counter-argument, because I always do this. And I think it is more important than ever here, because this is a situation where the honest answer is genuinely complicated. The strongest counter-argument goes like this. China paid real costs, too. The disruption to Hormuz traffic hit Chinese supply chains hard. Chinese oil imports fell to an 8-year low by May 2026. The economic shock of a $100 per barrel oil price in a country that imports as much energy as China is not trivial, and China's diplomatic positioning, while sophisticated, also has limits. It cannot fully capitalize on its influence with Iran if Iran's regime becomes unstable, if hardliners continue to undermine the ceasefire, or if the 60-day negotiation window collapses and the war resumes. China's gains are real, but they are also conditional on a degree of stability that is not guaranteed. This argument deserves to be taken seriously. I acknowledge it fully. The strategic reserve cushion that Beijing built was real preparation, not magic. And the fragility of the ceasefire is a genuine risk to everything China has collected. But here is what the counterargument cannot account for. And this is the crucial asymmetry at the heart of this entire story. The United States went into this war with $39 trillion in national debt, a war powers resolution that nearly passed Congress, an Israeli ally that publicly defied direct presidential orders, a Gulf security architecture that was pummeled by 4,000 Iranian drones, and a domestic political situation that made extending the conflict increasingly untenable. America needed to get out. And to get out, America signed a deal. And that deal, on the most careful reading of its text, conceded administrative authority over the Strait of Hormuz to the country America just spent billions of dollars trying to bring to heel. China went into this war with 1.2 billion barrels of strategic reserves, zero military commitments, zero casualties, a growing BeiDou testing dataset, a diplomatic reputation that rose throughout the conflict, and a ceasefire agreement that its preferred partner Iran signed on terms that preserved the Iranian regime, kept the nuclear program intact under collapsed tunnels and landmines, and codified new Iranian authority over the strait. Those are not equivalent positions. Those are not two sides of the same strategic coin. One side paid the cost of the war, the other side collected the dividend. Let me bring everything together now in one clear picture, and then I will give you three specific things to watch. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. The stated objectives were the elimination of Iran's nuclear program, the destruction of its missile capabilities, the dismantling of its proxy network, and the permanent unconditional opening of the Strait of Hormuz. On June 17, 2026, Trump and Xueqin signed a memorandum of understanding. Iran's nuclear material is buried under collapsed tunnels and explosive mines. Hezbollah is still in Lebanon and Israel is still bombing it. The strait is open under a 60-day framework that on Iran's reading gives Tehran administrative authority and fee collection rights. And within 48 hours of the deal being signed, Iran's foreign minister personally briefed China's Wang Yi on the terms. China, throughout this entire period, provided Iran with BeiDou 3 satellite navigation that dramatically improved Iranian missile accuracy in a way that gave China live-fire data on its own military technology against U.S. electronic warfare systems. Chinese satellite intelligence companies tracked U.S. force movements for Iran. Chinese companies supplied missile components. China and Russia vetoed the UN resolution Washington wanted. China backed Pakistan's mediation, which produced the ceasefire framework. Chinese diplomatic positioning rose throughout the conflict, while American reputational credibility with its own Gulf allies eroded significantly. And now China is positioned to lead Iran's post-war reconstruction, to receive preferential Hormuz transit rates, to continue expanding yuan-denominated oil settlement through CIPS at record volumes, and to add a real-world combat dataset to its military planning for the Taiwan scenario. Sun Degang at Fudan University asked whether America's Suez moment has arrived. Let me offer you a different frame. The Suez crisis ended British imperial pretension permanently, but Britain survived it. Britain is still a significant country. The question after America's Hormuz moment is not whether America survives. It will survive. The question is, who writes the rules of the room that comes next? And right now, the answer to that question looks less and less like Washington, and more like Beijing. Three things to watch, because predictions are how you test a theory. Prediction number 1. Watch the 60-day negotiation window. The MOU, signed June 17th, gives 60 days for the parties to finalize a permanent deal. Watch specifically whether the technical nuclear negotiations collapse, as I believe they will, given the 6 unresolvable deadlocks I outlined in a previous lecture. If those negotiations collapse before the deadline, watch whether China actively works to extend the ceasefire rather than letting it expire, because China's interest is stability for its energy supply chains and reconstruction investment. China will not want this war to resume. If China begins active diplomatic intervention to prevent a breakdown, that is confirmation that Beijing now sees itself as a permanent stakeholder in the Middle East order, not a peripheral observer. Prediction number 2. Watch the BRICS summit in India in September 2026. India is the second largest buyer of Iranian oil and a BRICS founding member. If the September summit produces formal language on non-dollar energy settlement, new CIPS participation from Middle Eastern countries, or any coordination on a shared framework for Hormuz transit governance, that is the signal that China's claim on the post-war Middle Eastern order is being institutionalized multilaterally, not just bilaterally with Iran. Prediction number 3. Watch Taiwan. Not in the Middle East. Watch what Beijing does with the combat data it collected from this war. If you see changes in Chinese military doctrine, new announcements about missile guidance systems, updates to Chinese naval electronic warfare protocols, or any public statements from PLA analysts that reference lessons from the Iran conflict, that is the clearest possible signal that China's asymmetric spectator advantage converted the Middle East war into a Taiwan scenario preparation asset. Because that is what the analysts at Small Wars Journal and Special Eurasia both concluded. China used this conflict to see how U.S. sensors respond to Iranian-style missile and drone swarms, how U.S. Aegis destroyers track and intercept ballistic missiles in real time, and how U.S. fifth-generation stealth aircraft perform against Chinese-supplied anti-stealth radar systems. All of that data is now in Beijing's hands, and all of it is relevant to the one scenario that American military planners consider their most serious near-term challenge. Here is your homework. Read the CNN analysis published June 20th, 2026, titled "China is Counting Its Wins from the Iran War," then read the Newsweek piece from the same week titled "What China Gained from the U.S. Launching a Failed War on Iran," then read the Atlantic Council analysis of what the U.S.-Iran deal means for the Middle East, specifically the section on China. Put those three documents side by side. They are all Western publications, not Chinese propaganda. And they are all saying, in different registers, the same thing, that China came out of this conflict better positioned than it went in, while the United States came out more indebted, more overextended, and more diplomatically isolated from the very Gulf allies it was supposedly protecting. Come to the comments and tell me where you think my analysis is wrong. I genuinely want that. That is the only way any of us gets closer to the truth. Let me leave you with this. The question everyone is asking right now is whether the ceasefire will hold, whether the 60-day window will produce a deal, whether Trump can claim a victory, whether Netanyahu will blow everything up with another Lebanon strike. Those are all real questions, and they matter. But the deeper question, the one that will define the next decade of global power competition, is this. In a world where wars are fought not just with bombs, but with financial architectures, satellite navigation systems, diplomatic narratives, and intelligence harvesting, which country has the doctrine, the patience, and the strategic depth to compete at all four levels simultaneously while letting its rivals exhaust themselves at the military level? America went into this war with the most powerful military in human history and came out of it having signed a document that its own partners in Jerusalem call a betrayal, that its own vice president called a wake-up call for Israel, and that its own analysts are comparing to the Suez crisis. China never fired a shot, and it walked away with combat data on its own weapon systems, a strengthened financial architecture for yuan-denominated energy trade, a diplomatic reputation that rose across the global south, a reconstruction contract pipeline into Iran's energy infrastructure, and preferential access to the world's most important energy choke point codified into an agreement that the United States signed. Washington was in the corner. It did not always know it was in the corner, but the prize was being claimed quietly on the other side of the room, and the party claiming it never raised its voice once. Subscribe to the channel. I will see you in the next one.